Welcome to this special episode of Salvation and Catastrophe, the Greek-Turkish War 1923. And what I'm going to do in this episode, I'm going to catch up a bit with what the two protagonists are doing, since I wasn't able to cover a lot of their activity during the normal episode that covered the events from January to March 1920. So in this episode, I'm going to focus a bit more on the activity of Greek Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos and the de facto leader of the representative committee of the movement for the defense of the rights of Rumelia and Anatolia, Mustafa Kemal Pasha, later Ataturk. Let's start with Eleftherios Venizelos. Eleftherios Venizelos had been far away from Greece for a very long period during the negotiations in Versailles, in Paris, and at London. And he had recently returned to Greece in preparation for the negotiations at San Remo and took the chance to address the parliament that had ended its recess and started its work again. So on 2nd February 1920, Venizelos gives a speech to the Greek parliament in reaction to a question by the opposition member of parliament, D. Chrysostalis, who asks why the prime minister has not granted a general amnesty to all political prisoners and has not restored to the army the officers' purge in the 1917-1918 period. Chrysostalis uses as the hook for his demand the recent passing of the ex-jurist Konstantinos Eslin, who had been exiled to Corsica in 1917, brought back to Greece in 1919, and put on trial for the November 1915 events and given a death sentence. In the same trial, but without being present, also Ioannis Metaxas was given a death sentence, and if I remember correctly, retired Admiral Michael Goudas was also given a death sentence. I can't remember if Douzmanis was included. Now, while in prison, Eslin became heavily sick and died at the tender age of 75. And he was declared a martyr by the Konstantinos side, added to the death of ex-Prime Minister Spiridon Lambru, back in 1919, or later 1918. I don't remember right now. Go watch my previous episodes. Now, Chrysostalis argued that in order to calm the passions and facilitate a union of the Greek people, Venizelos should try to push for a general amnesty and restoration of the purged officers and judges. He argued that it is only Venizelos that could do something like this. Now, in reaction, Venizelos takes a chance to defend his policy of 1916-1917. First, he claims that his actions were part of a counter-revolution against an attempted Constantinist revolution, whose goal was to overthrow the constitution by violating the spirit of the constitution, to overthrow the constitutional order. Then he justifies the purges as needed in order to secure the regime from the attempts of the Constantinists to trigger insurrections and mutinies. He notes, and we have to keep in mind that in 1918 there had been 2 mutinies in the army, 2 regiments had mutinied out of the 20 mobilized, so that's not a small number, that's about 6,000 men. Now, he notes that his last decision to lift censorship had led to an inflammation of the passions by the Constantinist papers. Interesting enough, the script monarchist paper, Constantinist paper, was not restored. That's why you cannot find online its issues from that lifting of the censorship. And he thus says that the conflict between Venizelos and Constantinos is not over, and that it will not be over until the Constantinists give up on their goal of restoring Constantine to the Greek throne. Let me take an opportunity to read to you a bit, and he's kind of mean into this. So he says, ερωτώ, είναι πραγματική η εκδήλωση αυτή των αντιδρόντων αντιπολιτευόμενων την κυβέρνηση όταν φτάνωσι να εξαιρούν ένα ακυλίδωτον κατά τα λοιπά άνθρωπον Και όταν έρχεται ο βουλευτής Σεβίας να τον αποκαλεί μάρτυρα ή μεγάλο μάρτυρα και να μου λέγει πρόσεχε να δώσεις το ταχύτερον χάρη σε αυτούς που είναι εις φυλακάς, διότι εάν αποθάνουν όλοι έστω και αν έχουν την ηλικία των 85 ετών, here Venizelos is making fun, ironizing that of course we shouldn't be held responsible for a 75-year-old dying even if we put him in prison, να γνωρίζεις Βενιζέλε ότι τους θεωρούμε μεγαλομάρτυρας. Κύριε βουλευτά εξεβίας, δεν συμφωνούμε στην αντίληψη αυτήν. Είστε έντιμος άνθρωπος καλής πίστεως και βεβαίως δεν έχετε την ακριβή αντίληψη της καταστάσεως. Ο αγών, κύριε, όχι ο εξωτερικός απλώς, αλλά ο αγών ο εσωτερικός δεν έλεξε. Ώστις ήθελεν ισχυρίστη. Από το αντιθέτου στρατοπέδιο ότι έλεξε θα έλεγε ανακριβή. Εγνώση θα έλεγε μη αληθή. Ο αγών συνεχίζεται. Ο αγών είναι αγών μεταξύ του ημείς ή σεις. Ταύτα δε υποστρατιωτικών νόμων υπολογοκρισία λέγονται ημείς ή σεις. Ο αγών συνεχίζεται με την παράβολον ελπίδα πολλών των διαξαγόντων αυτών, όχι πάντων να επαναφέρωσιν επί του θρόνου έναν έκπτωτο βασιλέα, ο οποίος επεβουλεύθη κατά της ελευθερίας του ελληνικού λαού και του εθνικών αυτού έργων. Και όταν αυτός ο αγών συνεχίζεται, ακόμη και κανείς δεν αποκρύπτει τους σκοπούς του, θα μου πείτε ότι φτάσαμε στο τέρμα του αγώνος και ήρθε ο καιρός της λύθης και της επίοικιας ώστε να αποκαταστήσουμε την εθνική οντότητα. Όταν υπάρχουν άνθρωποι οι οποίοι και το ζήτημα της επαναφοράς του βασιλέως μπορούν να κάνουν αντικείμενον εκλογικής διαπάλης, ώστε να εκδηλωθεί δια το έθνος το ειδικό μας η τερατώδης αυτή αντίληψη, κατά την οποία κάθε κόμμα ερχόμενον στα πράγματα θα προσεκόμιζε και τον υπεύθυνων αρχηγών της εκτελεστικής εξουσίας και τον ανεύθυνων. Θα έχουμε δύο βασιλείς, ο εις εν ενέργεια, ο άλλος εν αντιπολιτεύση, και κάθε φορά που θα ερχόμεθα στην αρχή θα εφέρουμε τον δικό μας και θα έπιπτεν ο άλλος. Όταν έχετε ανθρώπους οι οποίοι έχασαν τα σφρένα, τυφλωμένοι από το πάθος των πολιτικών ιστιούτων σημείων, ώστε να μην αποκρύπτουν τα προθέσεις των και να πιστεύουν ότι είναι δυνατόν να είδομεν και αυτό το έσχος της αυτής διαρρυθμίσεως του πολιτεύματος, να έχουμε δύο βασιλείς, τον ένα εν ενεργεία και τον άλλον εν εφεδρεία, θα ομολογήσετε κύριε βουλευτά εξεβίας ότι ο αγών δεν είναι τερματίστη και ότι η στιγμή κατά την οποία ζητείτε την επίοικια ταύτη είναι η στιγμή κατά την οποία ο αγών έχει φτάσει εις το κατακόρυφο. He then says that the struggle will only be over when the Constantinians give up their goal of restoring Constantine to the Greek throne. And he explains how he believes this conflict will only end, which is when his successful foreign policy brings about a Turkish peace treaty that shows to all Greeks, with the exception of those that he calls the insane, that Venizelos and the Liberal Party were in the right, and that all that they did since 1915, even if momentarily cruel and petty, was worth as a sacrifice for the greater goal of a greater Greece. Any amnesty and restoration of purged officers can only come in the 15-year period after a successful peace treaty with Turkey, not before. Again, let me read you. Θα ανησυχήσετε ίσως διότι η παράταση αυτού του αγώνος μπορεί να είναι μακρά. Ελπίζω ότι δεν θα είναι μακρά. Εγώ και άλλοτε έλαβον αφορμή να εκθέσω από το βήματος τούτο πως προβλέπω την λύση αυτού του εσωτερικού αγώνος. Είπων, όταν ο εξωτερικός αγών τερματιστεί εντελώς, όταν θα έχουμε τη ρύθμιση όλων των εθνικών ζητημάτων δια της υπογραφής της συνθήκης μετά της Τουρκίας, όταν θα δυνάμεθα να εμφανίσουμε πρώτου έθνους όλους τους σκραπούς της πολιτικής στην οποία αναλαβόμεν εξ ονόματος του, τότε δεν απολείπει η πεποίθηση. Αν δεν σας φαίνεται βαρία η λέξη, ας πω η ελπίς, αλλά η ελπίση βάσιμος ότι όλοι οι Έλληνες εκτός ελάχιστων πλέον ατομικών εξαιρέσεων, των οποίων η διανοητική ή ψυχολογική κατάσταση θα έχει επηρεαστεί κατά τρόπον ώστε θα έπρεπε να εγκλειστώσουν εις φρενοκομείων, όλοι λέγω οι αληθείς Έλληνες θα αναγνωρίσουν, άλλοι μεν δημόσια, άλλοι δε κατηδίαν, ότι ευτύχημα είναι ότι αυτός ο άνθρωπος τέλος πάντων ευρέθηκε έχον το θάρρος, το οποίο είχε να αναλάβει αυτόν τον αγώνα και να μας οδηγήσει εις αποτελέσματα τα οποία δεν φανταζόμασταν τόσο δυνατά απέναντι των καταστροφών, οι οποίες συνεκομίζονται δια της αντιθέτου πολιτικής. Βεβαίως κακόν είχε αυτή η δουλειά ότι αυτά τα έκαμε αυτός ο σατανάς, he means himself, και ομολογώ ότι κατά τούτο τα πράγματα κακώς έχουν, αλλά θα έχω το δικαίωμα να τους υπώ. Κύριε, σας ζητώ συγγνώμη. Είμαι αληθώς τεθλιμμένος ότι δεν έγινε δυνατόν τα πράγματα να τελεστώσουν άνευ της δικής μου άμεσης πρωτοβουλίας. Αλλά θα έχω το δικαίωμα, λέω ταύτα, να υπώ κάτι το οποίο δεν απομακρύνεται από βαθμική αίσθημά μου, δεν είναι άγνωστο όταν απεχώρησα από την αρχή την πρώτη φορά και οι διάδοχοί μου σκέφτησαν να ακολουθήσουν την πολιτική την οποία επέκριναν, τον έσπευσα να τεθώ εις τας διαταγώστων και δήλωσα ότι είμαι πρόθυμος να συνεργαστώ με ταυτόν, όχι ως υπουργός, ως ανεπίσημος σύμβουλος, ως γενικός γραμματέας, αν ήθελαν του Υπουργείου των Εξωτερικών, για να χρησιμεύσω μέχρι τέλους. Έπαξα ό,τι ή το δυνατόν. Αν όμως δεν κατέστη δυνατόν παρά ο Σατανάς να ηγηθεί αυτής της εργασίας, τούτο εγένετο διότι δεν ευρέθη άλλος να τον εγκαταστήσει. Θα τους υπώ εις αυτούς τους συμπολίτες μου, οι οποίοι δεν είναι φίλοι μου, σας ζητώ συγγνώμη, συγχωρέστε με, δεν το ξανακάμω επιτέλους. Kind of full of irony. Kind of full of irony. But it is very clear that Venizelos is still very much angry about the national schism and very much opposed to the idea of resolution of the schism by a general amnesty or restoration of the officers. Now, there are reasons for this. It will be hard for Venizelos to do a general amnesty because even if he wanted, it would essentially anger a lot of the supporters of his own party. While when it comes to the restoration of the purged officers, that's impossible because it is blocked by the officers currently serving in the Greek army, most of which had supported the Thessaloniki national defense. And any return of those officers would essentially put those officers out of the lists for promotion. I'm going to talk about this later in the future a bit more. Now, on 9 February 1920, Venizelos again addresses the Greek parliament, this time to discuss the crucial issue of the redistribution of the large-scale agricultural properties in Thessaly and Macedonia, called chiefliks, among the large population of ex-serfs or properly less agricultural workers that worked there. Now, in southern Greece and the Peloponnesus, large-scale redistribution of Ottoman Muslim-held land had followed the Greek independence war. Because in 1821, 43% of the land in the Greek state that became independent in 1833, in the territory that became part of the Greek state in 1833, was owned by 8% of the population, which was the Muslim minority, which explains a bit the amount of hatred, anger, and essentially ethnic cleansing and the massacre that happened to the Muslims. They were essentially a small minority that owned almost half of the land, while the rest of the population was essentially fighting over the rest of it. Now, in Thessaly and Macedonia, this was not the case. Most Muslim landowners had been smart enough to sell their large chiefliks to Greek capitalists, who essentially used the chiefliks as collateral for big loans and stuff like that. Also, in Macedonia, 53% of the Muslim population had remained after the Greek occupation, conquest, liberation, whatever you want, which made redistribution of their properties illegal. Now, the majority of that Muslim population was just like the Greeks, poor, propertyless farmers or small-time farmers, but there were a couple of very big, powerful landowners. Now, by 1911 in Thessaly, the situation over land redistribution had led to large-scale social unrest funded by the early Greek anarchist movement, for example, Marinos Antipas. Demand for redistribution was big and led to essentially agricultural revolution at Kileler. But the events of 1912-1920, the Balkan Wars, the national schism, made it impossible to implement it. Both the Constantinists, with politicians like Dimitrios Gounaris, and the Venizelos ones, with politicians like Alexandros Kafandaris, were radical on this issue, pushing for redistribution, seeing redistribution as a way to cut the power of the elites in the country and to make the population more loyal to the Greek national idea. But Venizelos himself was more cautious. In his speech, he stressed the importance of redistribution for dampening the rise of radical political ideologies in Greece, namely essentially Bolshevism and socialism. Venizelos argued that a general redistribution will put Greece in the same standing as the other Balkan states, and importantly, win over the non-Greek population of Macedonia and Thrace, since he argued that they would also gain from redistribution. He then discusses that he believes that both the far left and the far right wing of the Liberal Party, which were opposed to either redistribution or no redistribution, will detach themselves from it over this issue, but argued that even after that, the core of the Liberal Party will be able to dominate Greek elections for a long period as long as Greece is able to attain its goal in the Turkish peace treaty. Venizelos essentially bet his dominance of Greek politics in the long term on a successful resolution of the Eastern issue with the Turkish peace treaty that accommodated as much as possible the demands of Greece. It is the peace treaty, it is victory in the Eastern question that will resolve the national schism by delegitimizing his opponents. It is victory in the national question, in the issue, in the Eastern question, that will give him the opportunity to dampen the passions over redistribution and give him the opportunity to do redistribution in a way which will essentially guarantee that the Liberal Party will become the mode, the central mode of the political system in Greece, dominant and only faced by either radical leftist or radical rightist smaller parties. This is the goal of Venizelos, and that's why for him the successful resolution of the Eastern question along the lines of Greek acquisitions in Asia Minor is a necessary and sufficient condition for success of his grand strategy and great plan for the reformation of Greek politics around his party and the creation of a Greek Reichsstaat. Now, what about Mustafa Kemal Pasha? Now, according to Nutuk, which I have over here in the really good English translation, a speech delivered by Gazi Mustafa Kemal by Turkish İş Bankası, the reprint of the 1928 translation of English, he's busy with the issue of the Ottoman Parliament and the resistance against the growing anti-nationalist movements in Anatolia. You could call those movements sultanicist movements if you want, but it's more correctly to call them anti-centralization movements, sultanicist movements. They have very different reasons, but they are essentially rising in arms and attacking nationalist organizations and those who support the representative committee. Now, in Nutuk, he ascribes most of this activity to the influence and machinations of Reverend Robert Frew, a Unitarian Canadian missionary in Istanbul, Constantinople. He actually wrote a letter to Frew admonishing him to stop the activity which he accused him of doing. Now, he spent a lot of the time between January and March in exchanging telegrams with the cabinet in Istanbul, Constantinople, under Ali Reza Pasha, wrangling over issues of precedence, authority, and what he called the activity of the Minister of Interior, which he said was essentially opposed to the nationalist movement and trying to weaken it. He again reiterated the opposition of the Representative Committee to any cession of Ottoman territory held in 1918 to either Armenia or Greece. Now, Mustafa Kemal Pasha recognized that atrocities have been committed against Christians in the Marmara Sea region, Balıkesir, Bigha, Adapazarı, and Izmitli Komedia, but he ascribes those atrocities to conspiracies hatched by elements in the Ottoman government opposed to the Representative Committee, which armed bands that attack Greeks and Armenians in order to excite foreign intervention against the Representative Committee. Yahya Kaptan, we talked a bit about his case in the normal episode, was thus for Mustafa Kemal, part of the attempt of the Representative Committee to suppress these anti-Christian bands, while for the Greeks and Armenians, he was one of the bands engaging in anti-Christian activity. Mustafa Kemal Pasha accuses a Major Necati Bey in collusion with a gendarmerie officer Nail Effendi and an Albanian gang warlord called Kuchuk Arslan of being behind the attacks and targeting Yahya Kaptan by accusing him of doing the crimes. The murder for Mustafa Kemal Pasha of Yahya Kaptan was indicative of the opposition of the Sultanate government to the national forces and the incompetence of the nationalists in Istanbul, Constantinople. For who was behind the anti-nationalist activity? Once more, Said Molla and Reverend Frew. He also got in an argument with Kazım Karabekir Pasha over the question of the transfer of the Representative Committee to Ankara. Now, what is interesting here is Mustafa Kemal's argument that no serious threat could be expected by Armenia. This contradicts his argument that the Caucasian barrier republics, Armenia, Georgia, had to be broken for the security of the nationalist movement. He accuses Cemal Pasha, Minister of War, of interfering with his call on the newly elected deputies to come and talk with him at Ankara before going to Istanbul, Constantinople. He discusses the Sheikh Eshrif incident at Bayburt. This was an Alevi Shia Kurdish revolt or attempt at revolt. He then discusses his arguments with the Minister of War on the issue of military appointments Cemal wanted to activate higher-ranking officers and send them to commands in Anatolia, many of the officers that had commanded during World War I, to replace the middle rankers that were loyal to Mustafa Kemal Pasha. Interestingly, Mustafa Kemal Pasha characterizes Nureddin Sakali Pasha as one of the Cemalist officers, if you want. Mustafa Kemal opposed a move that will deny him the control of the military in Anatolia. Mustafa Kemal Pasha then explained his logic for the peace negotiation. He argued that first a cabinet carrying the full confidence of the chambers of deputies must be formed, and that the main argument of the cabinet in the peace negotiations is the independence and sovereignty of the country that should be paramount. Any administrative reforms must be taken by a sovereign and independent state, and not as part of the dictates of the Entente powers. The guiding principle should be the Sivas Memorandum. Especially important was opposition to Article 7 of the Mudros-Mondros Armistice, which permitted the occupation of certain territories and strategic areas within the Ottoman Empire by the Entente. He then goes into a really nasty attack against the parliamentarians for refusing to create a party named the Party for the Defense of Rights and creating their own party. He also laid out his strategy. The Chamber of Deputies in Istanbul-Constantinople must resist and stand up to British demands until such a point as the British push for its dissolution. It then must flee to Ankara and declare itself the government. He also calls for the chamber to force the fall of Ali Riza Pasha and thus a governmental crisis. Interestingly, he ascribes Armenian actions in Adana Cilicia to revenge, but he does not explain revenge for what. What were the Armenians trying to avenge? He engaged in correspondence with both Rauf Orbay in Istanbul-Constantinople and Kazım Karabekir Pasha. The central question was, what should the representative committee do if the assembly caved to the pressure by the Grand Vizier and declared that it was the center of national will and that the representative committee should dissolve itself? Mustafa Kemal had no intention to do this, but according to him, Kazım Karabekir was willing. Now remember, Nutuk is Mustafa Kemal Pasha's version of history. Mustafa Kemal Pasha knows that he was supportive of Ismet Pasha going to Istanbul to work with Hizmi Çakmak. Andrew Mango disagrees. Leave it there. He then spends time on his correspondence with Jafer Tayyar Pasha at Edirne, Adrianople, and discusses the conflict between the Karakol Society of Nationalists in Istanbul-Constantinople, Karabasif is the leader of that, on one hand, and Jafer Tayyar on the other. Important to note is Mustafa Kemal Pasha's position that Eastern and Western Thrace were two different cases. And while the nationalist movement can support from Eastern Thrace and liberation movement in Western Thrace, it must not initiate a conflict there, but focus on holding Eastern Thrace. Equally important is his mentioning of the Bulgarian agitation for an exit to the Aegean Sea. In general, it was clear that the nationalist cause had a hard time advancing in Eastern Thrace. Part of the reason was the large presence of the Greek population in the region, which had increased by the arrival of refugees and deportees from 1914-1918 period. Areas like Chatalja or southern Gallipoli, for example, had a Greek majority according to the Ottoman census of 1914, and cities like Terkidag, Raidesto were heavily Greek. This is why Venizelos was willing to accept a League of Nations state in Muslim-dominated Western Thrace, but demanded incorporation of Eastern Thrace into Greece. Mustafa Kemal Pasha then spends time discussing the problems with the Karakol society. Then he chides the Malta prisoners, Rauf Orbay and Karabasif, and discusses how he received the news of the occupation of Istanbul-Constantinople. Interestingly, he does not note the taking of the National Pact, the Mishaki Milli, by the Ottoman Chamber of Deputies. Pretty much, he turns the deputies into a joke, into his enemies. I mean, that's a major thing to leave out, but it makes completely sense, since the whole point is to point out how the only potential leadership for the national movement could be in Ankara. And the parliament, the Chamber of Deputies in Istanbul-Constantinople, was a corrupt, incompetent organization that simply could not provide leadership. Then he covers the activity he took in reaction to the occupation. There are several points of interest. First, he argues that the occupation violated Wilsonian principles and the rules of conduct of the civilized world. He argues that Ottoman Christians will not be protected by the major powers, and that they can only find safety in submission to the protection of the national government. 3. The occupation of Istanbul-Constantinople renders the Ottoman government null and a prisoner of the Entente, necessitating the taking of a leadership position by the representative committee. 4. In his messages toward the international audiences, he connected liberating Istanbul with the liberation of the Islamic world, and thus speak of holy war and a call on God. Let me read you. Let me read you two of his declarations. Okay, first of all, let me go. Where are we? Not the election. Okay. Where are we? So, first of all, to the Allied powers. To the 16th March 1920, to the Italian representative Adalia, to be forwarded to the diplomatic representatives of England, France, and Italy, the diplomatic representative of the United States in Istanbul, the foreign ministers in neutral countries, the legislative chambers in France, England, and Italy. All the official buildings in Istanbul, including the Chamber of Deputies, which represents the symbol of our national independence, have been formally and forcibly occupied by the troops of the Entente powers, and have proceeded to arrest a great number of patriots who have been acting in accord with the aims of the national movement. This last blow, which has just been directed against the sovereignty and political freedom of the Ottoman nation, strikes still more than at the Ottomans, who are resolved to defend their lives and their independence at all costs, at the principles that have been regarded by humanity and civilization of the 20th century as sacred, such as the sense of freedom, of nationality, and of country. At the principles also of modern society and human conscience which has created them. As for ourselves, we are imbued with the sacred character of the struggle we have entered upon for the defense of our rights and independence, and we are convinced that there is no power on earth that can deprive a nation of its rights to existence. We are not content to leave it to official Europe and America, but to the Europe and America of science, culture, and civilization to judge rightly the character of the step which constitutes a conspiracy such as history has never recorded down to the present day, and which is incompatible with the honor and self-respect of the peoples who have enjoyed it. It is actually based on downright dishonesty. By an armistice based on Wilson's principles, the nation has been deprived of all means of defense. Once more and for the last time, we draw your attention to the great responsibility in the eyes of history which this event will involve. Next to God, the lawfulness of our cause and its sacred character are our search strongholds in these painful hours of difficulty. And let me read you the proclamation to all commanding officers, to all vadis and mutesarfis, to the Union for the Defense of Rights, to the United Press. The various steps which have been taken by the Entente powers with the object of dividing up our country are already known to you. Firstly, after having come to an understanding with Ferit Pasha, they decided to subject our defenseless nation to foreign administration and to annex different important parts of our country to the colonies belonging to the victorious powers. The will and determination of the national forces, supported by the whole of the nation, shown in the defense of our independence, have shattered these designs. Secondly, they have addressed themselves to the representative committee with the object of ensuring the national forces and of ensnaring the national forces and of pursuing a policy of predominance in the Orient with their consent. The committee has refused to enter into negotiations of any kind until the independence of the nation and the integrity of its territory has been secured, and before else until the occupied districts have been evacuated. Thirdly, they have interfered in the acts of those governments that have associated themselves with the national forces. They have attempted to shake national unity and encourage the treachery of the opposition. One after another, these attacks have been wrecked by the determination and solidarity which sprang from the national unity. Fourthly, they have begun to influence public opinion by speaking about disconcerting decisions which have been arrived at regarding the fate of the country. These threats also have had no effect on account of the will and determination of the Ottoman people, who have resolved to submit to every necessary sacrifice for the defense of their honor and their country. Lastly, the forcible occupation of Istanbul today has destroyed the 7 centuries-old existence and sovereignty of the Ottoman Empire. Consequently, the Turkish nation is compelled today to defend its civilizing capabilities, its rights of existence and independence, and its entire future. We shall have won the appulse of mankind and shall pave the road to liberation which the Islamic world is yearning for if we deliver the seat of the Caliphate from foreign influence and defend it with religious fidelity, fidelity in a manner worthy of our glory and realize the independence of the nation. God is with us in the holy war which we have entered upon for the independence of our country. Mustafa Kemal, in the name of the Representative Committee of the Union for the Defense of Rights of Anatolia and Rumelia. Then he discusses his difficulties with Jemalettin Arif, the Speaker of the Chamber of Deputies, and the condition of the nationalist forces, noting desertions due to the lack of pay and the activity of pro-Sultan officers. He then discusses the eruption of the Düzce rebellion and the rising of the Adapazarh region on the side of the nationalists. So that's it. As you probably noted, both Mustafa Kemal Ataturk and Eleftherios Venizelos tend to be rather ironic and mean in their speeches and their writing and their treatment of their opponents. And there is a commonality in interest here. Both Mustafa Kemal Pasha and Venizelos wanted to see an end to the Chamber of Deputies in Istanbul. Now, Mustafa Kemal Pasha understood that that would happen anyway because he didn't believe that the British would be able to resist interfering and stopping a chamber that was essentially challenging towards the occupation forces. So it's not necessary that he wanted the chamber to be closed, but he bet on the chamber being closed, and it was imperative that that would happen because otherwise he would have to compete with another potential nationalist center in Istanbul, Constantinople. And this is why in Nutuk, which is written much later than the events, he spent so much time essentially presenting the Chamber of Deputies and the nationalist organizations in Istanbul like Karakol as bumbling incompetents, cowards, and so on. Venizelos wants the Chamber of Deputies to be closed because he sees it as one more step towards the expulsion of the Ottoman government from Istanbul, Constantinople. You see, Venizelos has not given up on Istanbul, Constantinople. He wants it for Greece, but he understands he has to wait long term for it. And he considers that the only way that opens that path possible is if the Ottoman dynasty is kicked out, sent to Bursa or Konya. So closing the Chamber of Deputies is, in his eyes, one more movement towards the delimitization of the Ottoman government in Istanbul, Constantinople. Venizelos actively argued that the Chamber of Deputies is dominated by the Committee of Union and Progress, and that is reason enough to close it. And he welcomed the news. So in this sense, the interests of the two parties overlap for very different reasons. Mustafa Kemal Pasha needs the center of resistance to be in Ankara. So there's only one national movement that can unify all forces. He understands that it cannot afford to be divided between Istanbul, Constantinople, and Ankara. While Eleftherios Venizelos wants, let me see, do I have a picture? Well, for Eleftherios Venizelos, getting rid of the Sultan is imperative, and part of that is closing the parliament. So that's the activity of both of these people in this period, as they are both maneuvering to take advantage of what they hope will be successful international events to essentially then solidify their domestic position.